How do you approach making the successor to one of the best-selling consoles of all time? Make it bigger and more powerful, then slap a 2 on the back and you're seemingly good to go. The Nintendo Switch 2 is an evolution of the hybrid formula that was experimented with the Wii U and fully realized with this Switch. The Switch 2 is by far one of the safest transitions between generations for Nintendo, which means there's a lot of refinement, but perhaps a lack of innovation. Being the most expensive Nintendo console ever, does the extra size and power justify the new price? Opening up the box, you get a familiar assortment of items: the console, Joy-Cons, the dock, a power brick and cable, a high-speed HDMI, TV protection, otherwise known as Joy-Con straps, and a grip. If you're like me and have multiple Switches with multiple users, setup can be quite a bit of a mess, but while you're sorting through that mess just trying to get to the games, you will notice how big the screen is. The original Switch lineup covered a decent range of phone sizes, but at 7.9 inches, the Switch 2 fits more on the tablet side of the screen spectrum. It's not an OLED, but the LCD panel is noticeably dynamic and colorful. 1080p up to 120 frames per second is what's truly impressive about this screen. Games look amazing on the go with better visuals than many handheld PCs. If you're coming from a Switch OLED, you will notice the downgrade in blacks, but overall the display is still a massive improvement. Visually, the Switch 2 looks more cohesive and elegant. There is almost an Apple-like quality to how visually smooth and frictionless the Switch 2 is. This carries over to the feel of the device. Buttons are more quiet and soft while just as responsive. We'll have to wait and see if stick drift is back in style, but so far the left and right sticks feel better than ever from a feedback point of view. With the bigger screen size, the Joy-Cons have gotten taller while just as skinny, but now the buttons are also bigger too. The face buttons are still small when compared to a PlayStation or Xbox controller, but noticeably larger over the original Switch. The softer press and bigger buttons feel great over long play sessions, but one of the worst aspects of the original Switch's designs has actually gotten worse, and that's the ergonomics of how you hold the console. The obvious reason for this layout is to keep the face buttons as close to the triggers as possible, but what ends up happening is most people will hold the Switch 2 from the top half of the sides rather than from the bottom, which is going to tire your hands out a lot quicker. This is by no means a deal breaker, in fact we've been putting up with it for years, but I can't help but wonder, what if they made the screen just a little smaller, moved the buttons down just a tad, and maybe added a lip on the back similar to the Wii U gamepad? Basically, we're compromising comfort for size, but with that said, the extra discomfort on the handheld side does result in a much improved tabletop experience. While you probably won't want to play outside under direct sunlight like a pre-backlit Game Boy, the bigger screen, additional top charging port, and adjustable kickstand actually makes tabletop play enjoyable. I don't have the best ear for audio, but even the speakers sound a little louder and clearer, especially over the launch switch. Snapping the Joy-Cons off and on is better than ever with this console's use of magnets over slide-in tracks. The stronger connection makes the console as a whole feel more sturdy and premium. On-the-go battery life doesn't seem particularly bad, but it's definitely not great. I feel most Switch 1 games last around as long as they did on the original model, but Mario Kart World in particular drains it in a fraction of the time. At this point, I'm curious to see how other flagship first-party games will eat up the battery going forward. Being a hybrid console, if the battery ever does die, you can always just put it into docked mode where you have the ability to go up to 4K. It's clear DLSS is at work here, but from the games I've played, the resolution and frame rate is surprisingly good even with that in mind. The Switch 2 is seemingly on par in some categories, while weaker in others compared to the current entry point of this generation in the Series S. So it'll be interesting to see how some third-party titles may thrive on Switch 2, while others may be forced to skip it. Regardless, at the minimum, Switch 2 seems to be in a better position to receive more third-party releases on day one. Mario Kart World is the most visually impressive title I have played so far, but part of the beauty of recent consoles is the ecosystem of last-gen games that are also brought over, along with new ports. I've tried out probably a dozen Switch 1 games, and all of them look and run at least somewhat better, with just the new hardware alone. There are paid deluxe upgrades and free updates, but even games that haven't been updated will still benefit. Some games like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are offered with dedicated upgrades that boost the overall image quality, while in certain cases they'll also offer additional content as well. Other titles like Super Mario Odyssey will only get a resolution bump, but compared to the two Zelda titles, you don't have to have a Nintendo membership or pay anything for that. Now, all of those titles ran perfectly fine for what the original Switch was, but some of the most substantial updates fixed certain titles that were borderline unplayable. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet still aren't pretty or impressive games to look at, but now they at least run acceptably. This isn't entirely surprising since a lot of performance issues can be fixed with just more power, but I was the most curious on how third-party games would run. Split Fiction looks great overall, even if at a lower frame rate, putting it side by side with the PS5 version, and it would appear the biggest difference is in resolution and some textures, but both versions still look great. I also tried out Hogwarts Legacy and thought it would be especially interesting to see where this version placed on the spectrum since there was an already heavily compromised Switch 1 version. Between the Series S and X, the Switch 2 version unsurprisingly seems to share the most in common with the S, but even then there appears to be additional compromises. The water in this scene is a perfect example. As you can see, I'm no expert, but thought it would be interesting to see for myself how Switch 2 stacked up against the original Switch and the other console manufacturers. With newer games always getting bigger and fatter, there is the issue of space. The Switch 2 has 8 times the storage of the Switch 1 with 256 gigs, but that's not going to get you very far before you have to delete games or put down some cache on an express microSD card. Adding fuel to controversy, many Switch 2 boxes will no longer carry a physical game, but rather just a download code. Perhaps even worse, other game boxes will have a cartridge that doesn't include the full game. You end up getting the worst of both physical and digital media, where you're tied to the physical commitment and space of a cartridge without being able to play or download off of it. I'd recommend staying clear of any games that take either of these two approaches. But on a side note, in case you were wondering, the cartridges still taste horrible. The current lineup of games at launch isn't mind-blowing, with most titles being third-party ports and Switch 1 upgrades. Not the most exciting selection, but there are definitely a lot of good old new, and new old games to play. Even though day one new first-party releases are a bit scarce, Nintendo has loaded up the calendar for the rest of the year with plenty to look forward to. This demonstrates their continued commitment to the platform, since a lot of why you buy a console is for the games to come on top of what's already here. Nintendo seems to be doubling down on the versatility of their platform, trying to make Switch 2 a home for almost any kind of game. Unlike the previous Switch, the Joy-Cons can now be used as mouses, or mice, or mices. While I doubt many games will utilize this new form of control, it does add to the overall versatility of the console. Genres like RTSs or first-person shooters will be more at home on the Switch 2 over any of Nintendo's previous hardware. In action, holding a Joy-Con sideways isn't as ergonomic as an actual mouse, but movement is just as smooth and precise on most flat surfaces. Note that as another reason why tabletop mode is actually useful this time around. I got my hopes up and tried out several original Switch titles, and none of them seemed to support the new mode, which, disappointing to me, also includes Super Mario Maker 2. Hopefully this just means Mario Maker 3 is just around the corner. The user interface is utilitarian and efficient, but also boringly vanilla. It will get you in and out of games, but I feel there's a lack of character and Nintendo charm. But this isn't new, but rather just a continuation of the original Switch's approach to UI. Probably the most advertised new system level feature is the introduction of game chat. In concept, it's not particularly interesting, but given the right situation, it's surprisingly handy. If a company is going to try and implement a Discord-like feature, it's going to live or die based on the convenience and audio quality. Testing it out in both handheld and docked mode, the audio quality is surprisingly precise at picking up the right audio, while also clear enough you can actually understand what other players are saying. The audio quality is here, but so is the convenience factor. Us modern humans will give up on just about anything if we can't pull it up within a couple clicks, which Nintendo seems perfectly aware of with the inclusion of a dedicated chat button. It only took Nintendo over a decade longer than the competition to finally include this feature, but to their credit, it's ironically and arguably the best of the big three at the moment as far as quality and convenience. Beyond the audio, up to 4 players are able to share their screens with people in chat. The video quality is unapologetically 2011 Skype bad, but for how most players will end up using it, I doubt that's going to be a big deal for many. I think its ideal use is to show where you are in a game, or if you're hanging around in a chat room, what game you're playing, since that's how kids these days hang out with their friends. I guess this is an improvement over splitting up a 20-inch CRT into fourths. There's also a camera feature if you get the extra accessory, which I didn't have a chance to test out since I didn't want to fork up the extra cash. Speaking of which, there is also now a new Pro controller. Simple, comfortable, back buttons, a good battery life, like many of the accessories, kind of expensive. It feels a bit pricey next to a DualSense or Xbox controller, but when you compare it to the Pro variants, it's not as bad. Using the Switch 2 over the past week has had me asking myself, why was the original Switch successful? The console came out of the gate underpowered, the Joy-Cons weren't very comfortable to use, and there wasn't much to do besides play games that were already on the Wii U. Despite all of that, the original Switch nailed the core pillars of any successful console. 1. The concept was easily marketed and understood. 2. There was an appeal for an audience with its unique form factor and versatility. And 3. There was a lot of great games ranging from ports to new releases and third-party support. And let's be honest, nobody besides me bought a Wii U, and so Mario Kart 8 felt like a brand new game. Switch 2 continues to ride off that success with a new additional emphasis on refinement, which I think's the right call here for being the successor of the Switch. While I think Super Switch would have sounded way cooler, there is no doubt that this is a play-it-safe sequel. New aspects of the console like the screen, overall performance, and game chat are better than I was expecting, while certain revelations like the use of key cards, high-priced hardware, and the introduction of $80 games is undeniably disappointing. Does the extra size and power justify the price of the Nintendo Switch 2? Personally, I would say yes on the console, but I'm not as convinced when it comes to accessories or software. More so than ever, value is going to be subjective to the buyer. I'm not sure if I will be buying very many, if any, games at $80 throughout this generation, but I am glad to finally have a more quality piece of hardware to play my Nintendo games on. What are your thoughts on the Switch 2? Give me your hot, cold, and lukewarm takes. As always, I appreciate you for watching, and until next time, see ya!